Get down here, Merc. Marlene! I'll come back.
So, what now?
As long as he's still out there. I
thought you beat him.
We can.
At the beginning of 2020, I had never played Final Fantasy VII, and when FF7 Remake came out in April, I didn't really care then either. But what got me interested in playing both games was seeing some end spoilers for the remake on 4chan that I thought were really interesting, and then seeing the absolute meltdown of internet personalities, or particular ones at least, over this remake even existing. Now, I think the gaming community does have a collective consciousness about the original FF7, right? Particular spoilers or certain, enemies or thematic elements that people kind of know, even if they haven't played the game, but I had to play both the original and the remake in order to find out what was making people so incredibly angry. In fact, I'm kind of bewildered after playing the game. Like, this game, out of all video games, out of all remakes, out of all reboots, if you want to classify it as one, this is the game people are having literal meltdowns over. Now, let me be clear. This is not the greatest game ever made or anything. I still think it is a good or great game. It's not one of the best games of all time, certainly not. But I just want to, convince people why I think this game is good. That when people say, oh, if you like this game, you don't even like the original Final Fantasy VII, or you don't have any good taste, that I want to kind of prove people wrong. Now, before we get into this, I just want to talk a little bit about where I'm coming from on this whole debacle, because I can't be fair and give a genuine analysis and talk good about FF7 Remake without explaining where I'm coming from about this, because the people who really don't like the game, and someone like me who does like it, probably have very different experiences with the original. Now, I didn't play the original FF7 until 2020, but I'm not old enough to even have been around for the era of gaming where FF7 was relevant. In fact, I was born after the original FF7 came out, which means that's right, I'm a PlayStation 2 baby. And listen, man, if you're gonna critique me and say, oh, you had to be there in order to properly critique the cultural context of both of these games, listen, man, film criticism still exists even though the people who are looking at fucking silent movies from the 1920s were not even, their parents weren't even conceived then. So I think it's fair game for me to talk about both of these games, even though I wasn't around when the original came out. In fact, I think my perspective is incredibly important because you see a lot of people who talk about their experience with the original, what it was like having the original be out. And you know what? That is a really important perspective, that we have that cultural context, that we have people like Maximilian Dude or BestGuyEver to talk about what it was like to play the game when it was relevant. But for me, to be able to go back and look at both, I think is a fair, different perspective that I don't think a lot of people seem to be valuing right now when it comes to talking about the remake. Now, it's not to say that I didn't take some extra lengths to play the game the way that it was intended so I can sort of better understand where the creators are coming from, because I played it on a CRT, which nobody's playing Final Fantasy VII on a CRT anymore. They're probably playing the PS4 version or the PC version. And yes, I know, the original translation of FF7 sucks, and I didn't get the full story, but listen, I've watched Tim Rogers' Final Fantasy VII translation series, which is totally fantastic. You should go check it out. And I think I kind of got the gist of what I was missing. Now, there are obviously going to be lots of types of people that are going to click on this video, from people who don't necessarily understand the critical meltdown of why people are reacting this way, all the way to people commenting right now about how I'm a Square Enix bootlicker, or I have no good taste in art, or that I'm a piece of shit or something. Fortunately, I've accommodated this video for all of you. At least for newcomers, I want to give some kind of context, because I didn't really understand kind of this cult appreciation of the original FF7 until I did all this research and I played both games. And so, at least for me, helping to explain that to other people will better help them to understand. Now that that's out of the way, let's get to why the original game is so important, and why do people love it so much back then? Now, for a game like Final Fantasy VII, it's not just enough that it has to be a good RPG in order to get the love and dedication it has had for all of these years. So, some historical context is necessary. See, Final Fantasy VII transcends being just another good JRPG. It actually has a very important place in the gaming industry. In fact, it has started trends that you can still see today in gaming. One of the things that FF7 did was really lean hard into making the game experience more cinematic. And I know that we're kind of all burned nowadays after generations and generations of game developers justifying things as cinematic, whatever bullshit they want to shovel down our throats, but this game really is more cinematic. It actively thinks about and uses and engages in using the camera in interesting ways for at least substantial moments in the game. And that is a huge leap compared to the competing JRPGs of the time, or even games like a couple years prior to its release. In fact, this game was so heavily budgeted and pushed so hard that it had ads in movie theaters before those were commonplace for video games. That what Squaresoft was saying at the time was, oh, look at our game, look at how cinematic it is, and look how, big it is, and you can't experience it in a theater, and this is the experience that you should want to buy. And I can't disagree with them. This game was one of, if not the most expensive JRPG when it came out in 1997. I've seen estimates thrown around that the game cost around $45 million to make. And Yeah, that's a lot of money, even in today's terms. But obviously, most of the game isn't the super expensive cutscenes that have crazy stuff going on. It looks like this, a polygonal version of what JRPGs on previous systems had done. And you know what? There are some more interesting dynamic camera angles that happen occasionally. But ultimately, outside of the cutscenes, a lot of it is kind of a souped-up SNES JRPG, but with some really good moments that are boundary-breaking sprinkled in there. Now, I say all this, but it still was mind-blowing back then. I mean, compare FF7 to Trials of Mana, which had come out 2 years previously and also was made by Squaresoft. And wow, that's a massive difference. Just to list off a couple things that FF7 has that Trials of Mana doesn't, it has fully 3D, not only overworld models, but hyper-detailed battle models as well. A fully 3D camera that doesn't stay overhead for the entire game, that the camera can move and has interesting angles depending on the screen that you load into. And it has these beautiful, gorgeous backgrounds to look at that aren't just sprite pixel-based. Now, to put into perspective how extremely popular this game was, from the sales estimates I could find, this game sold around 10 million copies worldwide. Now, that's a really huge number and is in the tippy-top 0.1% of games that ever sell games, right? That is a huge achievement, but 10 million, yeah, it's kind of special, kind of not, right? Your average Call of Duty sells about that every year. Well, to put that in perspective, Final Fantasy 15, which also passed the 10 million mark, had the advantage of the gaming audience growing for 20 years after FF7. So, when you consider that 15 only got to the same amount of sales as 7 with a much bigger consumer base, yeah, this game was mega popular in its day. In fact, I think the explosion of JRPGs that we got during the PlayStation 1 and even into the PlayStation 2 era was a direct result of this game's success. And I think every game from that period does owe a little bit of its success to this game helping mainstream the genre. But ironically, I think this game's extreme success has kind of cast a dark shadow over Squaresoft and eventually Square Enix on anything they try to do with the Final Fantasy series post 7. And I'm sure that some of you have, your favorite FF games from post 7. And, that's cool. But this is the game that has had the mainstream's attention. And I don't really think that any Final Fantasy game after 7 has really recaptured that mainstream attention like this game has. When you talk to somebody about Final Fantasy, who maybe isn't a Final Fantasy fan, but maybe is just a general gamer, this is the one they're probably going to refer to. This is the moments they probably are going to talk about. This is the characters that they are probably going to love, are from this game. And I think it's because of that lack of mainstream attention and success that 7 got that Square Enix went really hard into Final Fantasy VII spin-offs with the compilation. So I've given enough backstory bullshit about this game and the remake, so what do I actually think? What do I actually think about the original game? Now, for a game that came out in the PS1 and N64 era, a lot of those games tend to age pretty badly, but I was actually very surprised at FF7 and how well-rounded as the game is, and how fun I find it to play, and how much it still holds up in current year. Now, firstly, I want to talk about combat in this game. It is definitely my favorite part of this game, and I think is the part that is most worth revisiting. Like, I do think that this game genuinely still has great gameplay and great mechanics and tons and tons and tons of systems and combinations of materia that you can spend a ton of time messing with. Now, I think the core of the combat system is really, really strong, but I more have a problem with sort of the content surrounding it, like the stuff that you use the combat system to fight. And there's some questionable decisions there. Now, before I played this game, I had a lot of people tell me that, you know, oh, Powerman, FF7, you don't need to grind at all. Like, if you always just do the main story content, don't make deliberately bad choices with the combat system, you won't run into any speed bumps at all. And, those bastards lied to me. Now, I personally ran into 2 walls playing this game that really messed up the pacing of the game severely. One of them was the literal Dragon Wall boss in the Temple of the Ancients, and good lord, I fucking hated that boss. God, that thing fucking killed the pacing of that game in, like, the most inconvenient spot. Like, I knew the big moment was gonna come up, but I was stuck at this stupid boss, and it was so annoying. So I did some research, and I found that I had to end up grinding time materia to get the stop ability so I can stop the Dragon Wall boss from absolutely slaughtering my whole party. And so basically, I just had to keep fighting and fighting and fighting until I got that stop ability to show up. And dear God, was it so incredibly repetitive to fight enemies over and over and over again, just praying and hoping that that materia would level up fast enough before I just stopped. And the other wall I ran into was the final dungeon. You might be like, oh, the final dungeon? Like, no duh, it's a, you know, a hard, challenging place that you're gonna have problems with, but I swear to God, grinding up for that final dungeon to make it through took my playtime from 30 hours to 35 hours for one dungeon to fight a couple of enemies before you get to that final boss sequence. And speaking of that final dungeon, I felt like as the game went on, I felt kind of more and more restricted with my choices as the battles got harder and harder and harder, right? Even as I ground and I made sure that I was caught up or above the levels of other enemies, that I felt like the playstyle, at least of the main content stuff, really kind of forced me to homogenize my builds and playstyle. I had more slots to put stuff in, but it felt like a lot of my time was just revolved around having to use those 2 abilities, and the other abilities kind of felt like incidental. It's like, okay, you know, I want to induce this because this enemy's weak to this, or that enemy's weak to that, I want to induce them to that, right? Instead of building cool play styles. Now, I really like the early game materia stuff, because the game just loved throwing different types of materia at you, and it's like, hey, you can use elemental spells, status effects, you know, things that, you know, you can link with any of those other ones, or maybe even weird stuff like enemy skills. Like, it just felt like the possibilities were endless, and the game was constantly trying to throw new materia at me with every new town I went in. But around halfway through the game, I noticed that the time and barrier materia felt less like fun, like, experimental things that, you know, I could do or I could not do. It was up to me and my choices, but they started to feel more necessary, and the game started to really revolve around having those 2 constantly active at any point in order for any of the battles to be, like, viable. But on the opposite side of the coin, haste really made the game for me. Like, it gave it kind of like almost this, like, sort of like speed chess feel to the game, that constantly my party members were filling up bar, and then I had to menu through to make the right decision in a quick enough time. And yeah, I know you can go into the menu options and, you know, slow it down if you want, but it just gave kind of this frenetic pace to the game that I never knew that I wanted, and now I really like it. Even, like, average enemies, like normal enemies I was fighting, it felt way more exciting when I cast haste at the beginning of a battle and just went nuts on it. Like, maybe it's just kind of like the action junkie in me, you know, trying to, like, you know, fit the square peg into the round hole that is JRPGs, but I really enjoyed that. Now, the party situation, I think, in this game is, like, really bizarre. I've never seen a JRPG quite set up like this, where, you know, because of the freedom of the materia system that you can put whatever ability on whatever character you want, there's not really a lot differentiating the characters between each other. Like, okay, some characters can hit enemies in the sky, some can't. Now take, for example, Aerith. Aerith being kind of the mage-type character and has, you know, supposed to have really good magic and really bad physical attacks. Like, I used a fair amount prior to her death, but once she died, I swapped her out with Yuffie, and I kind of put, like, sort of a similar build on Yuffie, of, like, just stacking her with magic, and to be honest, I couldn't really tell a difference. Like, I felt like Yuffie played the exact same as Aerith, but her physical attacks didn't suck as much. I mean, it's not technically a problem because it doesn't, like, break the game or, like, make the game significantly worse or anything like that, but in a game that makes you really try to care about its characters and, like, gives you all these different stories about these characters, like, the fact that it doesn't really incentivize you to change your party at all, or, you know, makes them different in any way in combat, kind of sucks, to be honest. And I know this because at some point in the game, I had switched to using exclusively Yuffie, Tifa, and Cloud as a team, and any of the problems I ran into was never solved with a party member switch. And then it's even more bizarre when you have the Bizarro Sephiroth fight at the end of the game, where you can have, like, multiple teams of party members fight him at the same time, depending on how quickly you beat the previous boss. And, like, then the game punishes you for not using all of your characters and keeping them under-leveled, when for literally the rest of the game has no incentive for you to switch, and there's no real reason to. Like, what the hell? Now, much like the gameplay, the story in FF7 I really enjoyed, but I never got that feeling of, like, it being, like, a perfect masterpiece like everyone says it is. I found the first half of the game up until Northern Crater to be quite good and have tons and tons of cool moments and good character moments and, you know, try to say interesting things. And the ending, I found, was very profound and open-ended and kind of beautiful even. And then you have that part between those two. But, like, I don't get what the point of most of the second disc is. It feels like the game loses a lot of its direction. It just feels like it's making me do a bunch of menial bullshit for the sake of padding out the game's runtime. Like, it's like, oh, hey, go to these locations you've already been and a couple new ones to go get these huge materia. And it just didn't feel very engaging. I didn't feel like I was learning anything new. Hell, even in combat, I felt like I wasn't really progressing my skills during that most of that second disc. And I guess directionlessness is appropriate, because after Aerith dies, you probably are feeling the same way Cloud feels. It's like, what's the point? Like, why am I even bothering? Like, what point is there to keep going? But I shouldn't feel the same way the characters feel when it comes to, like, a 40-hour RPG, and I need to play for multiple more hours in order to find a interesting thread to keep following on. But for people to sit here and say, yeah, FF7 is perfect storytelling, no story beat is wasted, when a lot of the second disc is tracking down fucking huge materia, it kind of makes me feel like I've been lied to about the quality of this game's story. Now, probably my favorite part of the whole FF7 story was the Cloud mind memory stuff. I found it very fascinating because video games aren't a very cerebral medium, and the psychological analyzation of characters is not video games' particular strong suit. Like, it can make you, as a player, psychologically feel a certain way by doing certain things to you, But in terms of actually, like, looking at characters, games aren't particularly good at that. And this game really subverts that. In fact, I love the evolution of the Nibelheim story throughout the game, that it starts off as kind of like this weird story that doesn't make any sense, and even the characters in-universe call it out. And then kind of the threads start to very slowly unravel throughout the game. Like, you visit Nibelheim, and it's filled with all these weird people, and that's kind of bizarre. And we go into Cloud's mind again and see it a second time, but differently. And then he falls into the Lifestream, and then what really happened? And oh, it turns out it's actually Zack. Now, it is really brilliantly plotted and really covers a lot of the plot, but I found that probably the most important cutscene that really, like, helped build out Cloud's character even more, like, is a hidden cutscene. The cutscene with Zack and Cloud, and ultimately Zack dying, is not in the Lifestream stuff. When Cloud is remembering, oh, it actually was Zack. No, you have to go back to the Shinra mansion and into the lab in order to get that cutscene to trigger. And I don't know why they decided to make it a hidden cutscene, because it adds so much to his character. I would have been fine if I put it anywhere in the main story, but here specifically is, like, so bizarre. And they should have just put it with all the other live streams sorting out the memory stuff. I mean, it thematically fits way better because it's Cloud trying to remember who he really is, and him trying to be honest about who he really is to Tifa. And so, to show, like, where who he is, like, really stops being that with that cutscene. But to be fair, I just might be projecting sort of my own expectations from the future onto these developers, because Zack has become such a huge part of the FF7 universe with all the compilation stuff that came after the original, that I just might be sort of putting expectations on the developers at the time that why is this cutscene not more important and put in the story, when maybe they didn't really think it was that important, that they didn't know that it was going to be expanded out and we were going to have things like Crisis Core, and, you know, we get to relate to Zack way more, that he ultimately was just kind of, you know, a plot twist, that it didn't necessarily matter as much who Zack was, just the fact that he existed. And so having a hidden cutscene like that made sense. The music in this game is really, really good, and I think that goes without saying because it's a Final Fantasy game, and tons of tracks in here have become classics, but I do want to say two things about the music. Now, my favorite track in this game, and to be honest, there's a lot of really good tracks, so it was hard to pick a favorite, but it's probably the City of the Ancients theme, and the reason why is because it does kind of the creepy music thing from, like, Lavender Town from Pokemon Red and Blue, but way better. And it is, like, really good at, like, transporting you, like, to that place. And listening to that, not only did it, like, transport me to that place, to, like, this creepy, abandoned ancient city where shit's gonna go down, but also, like, it felt like it transported me back in time to 1997 playing this game for the first time, even though I've never had that experience, and it's no longer 1997. It is that good of a track. And the other thing is that even though I love One Winged Angel in almost every other version that it's shown up in post FF7, I find it to not be as, like, enjoyable in this game for me. I think it's just because it has the MIDI stuff underneath. I'm not, like, getting as much into it. Like, I feel like One Winged Angel is the kind of song that needs, like, an orchestra or, like, you know, a little bit more substantive instrumentals compared to the PS1's sound chip just working its little heart out trying to play this song. So that's what I think of the original game. I generally like it overall. There's some qualms I have with some of the stuff, but I find that they're more, like, sort of nitpicks. But I do think that the game is really strong and really holds together well. And, you know, it's still obviously a classic for reasons, and it gets keeps getting re-released a billion times over. But what about the remake? With such a solid base, like, what can the remake really do to make it set itself apart from the thing that it's building on top of, aside from a different combat system, and have everything be in modern graphical style?